maybe show a few of his little trinkets here and there, and he was hired. The first radio company, to my knowledge, that hired Mr. Moray, P. Henry Moray, was the E.H. Scott Radio Laboratory, not H.H. Scott. Most everybody's familiar with H.H. Scott. That was the Scott up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that manufactured audio equipment and hi-fi equipment in the late 40s to the early 70s when they sold to a Japanese company. I'm talking E.H. H.H. was Herman Holzner Scott. E.H. was Elmer Holzner Scott. I've heard reported that they're either brothers or they're cousins. I'm not sure which. Although E.H. Scott was a lot older than H.H. Scott. But it's the same middle name and the same last name. This fellow started out with the Scott Transformer Company. He started to build some very high-quality radios in the 20s. In the 30s, he came up with these grand consoles that were chrome-plated. In the 30s, these things sold for like $3,000 a piece, which was the price of a house back then. He was aiming this at the rich and the wealthy. He put on his advertising, if you can tolerate anything else, don't buy a Scott. Now, he hired Moray to design him a superior receiver. And Moray developed for him what was known as the Scott Imperial, which later became the Scott Philharmonic. The Philharmonic and the Imperial, the coil structures are identical in it, because they're the Moray coils. He did some very unusual things from the viewpoint of engineering, and came up with a radio that would pick up Europe without interference, didn't fade, and high fidelity quality. You could tune in. You could sit out here in Long Island. I have a Scott Philharmonic in my house and an Imperial. I can tune in New York radio stations and they sound like FM on it. They're that clean. Of course, Scott went a long ways on the Moray designs, and he then traveled to Hamilton Manufacturing in New York. Scott did his design work in the early 30s. In mid-30s, he traveled to Hamilton Manufacturing and designed the original Super Pro. That had a lot of common coil structures as to the Scott receivers. Then he went to work for Fisher Raymond coil structures as to the Scott receivers. Then he went to work for Fisher Radio Company and designed the famous Fisher Model 50 amplifier, which of course resembled a Hamilton amplifier and resembled a Scott amplifier. I wonder why. And all my designs here are still based on that early Moray design for my audio amps. I still use the same design. Moray was one of the first ones to realize that you had to drive a 6L6 through a low impedance transformer driver. When you got that, you got a phase conjugate laser, bouncing laser effect between the driver transformer and the output transformer. The relativistic signal went both ways between the two transformers, and of course would bounce from input to output. We get an amplification, but also relativistically, you got an amplification when you went from the output to the input of the two. And this signal just kept bouncing between these two barriers, these transformers. And it kept building up more and more relativistic function.
This, if you'll pardon me for interrupting, this reminded me just now of the Farnsworth multi-packer tube, where you had this reflectivity going back and forth.
You got the same thing with photo multipliers.
Photo multipliers, yeah. Go ahead. This is fascinating.
Then, of course, Mr. Moray went to work for the government again. And that's when everything went under the carpet for secrecy.
Okay. What was he involved in, as far as you know?
He designed a lot of very strange etheric receivers for the military. I haven't been able to get even any soft proof for this, but I've had one individual tell me that he worked at Fort Monmouth in the 50s. And that he did, worked at Fort Monmouth Signal Corps Laboratories. The big radio laboratory at Fort Monmouth. I'm still looking further into this, trying to get more witnesses that can verify, yeah, there was a madman that talked of radiant energy and talked of free energy.
This had something to do...
my investigation procedures on this is to find older people who are retired that work for these different companies and ask them, do you have any strange characters coming to the company? And I asked the man that retired from E.H. Scott, very old man. He said, oh yeah, we've had this fellow, he described it, who came in and talked about free energy and radiant energy. Now, it wasn't Tesla. And I started to gather E.H. Scott paraphernalia. Scott put out like a little monthly forum, and who was pictured in one of those forums? T. Henry Moray. He's there, bare-faced, right out in the open. You can recognize him. He and E.H. Scott was sitting side by side doing something in the laboratory, one of the pictures. And I got almost identical story from a person retired from Hamilton in New York.
Can you tell more about the etheric receivers? I mean, we know a little bit about this thing.
It's essentially how you wind the coils, the material you make the coils out of, how much voltage you put on the vacuum tubes. That's the key. How the chassis are laid out. The signal's got to flow through the receiver.
Yes, we saw this in the Tesla receiver inside. The signal seems to go right through it effortlessly. The etheric receiver of Moray seemed to be almost like a dowsing instrument because you didn't need a microphone.
Or like a radionics instrument.
Yeah, because you could laterally scan the Earth and pick a point and listen in on conversations without a microphone, apparently.
This is one of the things Moray finds.
Okay.
I don't know, I don't think any of the commercial receivers he designed had that capability.
No.
Although a psychic could probably use almost any receiver that has vacuum tubes and it is laid out properly to do that.
Yes.
The psychic can use a radionics instrument that's designed and laid out properly. Also, these instruments have to be built in special ways. It's very important what is the assembly person thinking of as they're building it. As you build the receiver physically, you're building a psychic image in that equipment.
Okay.
This is why you'd rather have a car that was built on Wednesday than one that was built on Monday or Friday. Cars built on Monday that you're working thinking, oh God, it's Monday, I got the whole week to go through, and Friday, they want to get out of there quick, and they're putting, both those days, they're putting in negative images. But Wednesday, they're just not settled down to do the proper thing. This is well known. That's because the image they put in the car is a vastly superior image to what's put in on Monday and Friday.
Now these images, by the way, can also imprint themselves in stones with a high metallic content. And so this represents, or quartz. So this represents a new way of storing information. And if somebody could
because we were
go
discussing
like that,
with the transmitters.
Yes.
One transmitter had a lot of information stored in it, the other one didn't.
Yes, absolutely.
We're still wondering why.
Yeah.
Now, what's the difference? I still can't tell you.
A lot of people thought that Moray's sound receiver was just a microphone and a very good amplifier, which was unheard of at the time, and I just don't believe that. I don't buy that. I don't think he had a microphone on it. I think it was just some kind of...
It would just pick up the ambient noise.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable.
You'd have to get over the ambient noise, away from the ambient noise locally to hear outside. The CIA's been trying to do this for years.
Right.
They've had the big dishes, the big ears.
Now, the Rogers people who were associating themselves with Thomas Hieronymus also had a dowsing device which was able to scan across the Earth laterally.
Well, that was Hieronymus more than Rogers.
Okay, well, is this the same Rogers as designed the antenna?
Yeah.
Okay, it's no coincidence then.
No, it's Larry Rogers, Larry H. Rogers.
Okay. Quite a remarkable device. They were looking for ore samples across the ground. I mean, the idea of scanning across the Earth betrays a lot more than ordinary electrodynamics, doesn't it? Okay.
So it goes into quantum electrodynamics.
Okay. Would you continue talking about, let's say, the relationship of Thomas Moray, Tesla, and possibly Wilhelm Reich?
Well, Moray and Tesla, we have not been able to find a connection between. There definitely is a connection between Wilhelm Reich and both men. Because Wilhelm Reich had T. Henry Moray early like in the 20s and the 30s, designing for him. In the 40s, he went over to RCA and had Mr. Tesla designing for him. When I bought those RCA receivers from the estate of another gentleman that died, I found literature, letters back and forth between that gentleman and T. Henry Moray for RCA. I mean, Wilhelm Reich for RCA, making those big receivers into orgone receivers. See, Reich was a medical doctor. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a physicist or an engineer. He had to hire somebody to do his engineering for him. And he had some very brilliant engineers up there with him.
So we're talking about, in all of this, we've been talking about extracting functions out of energetic beams, which are not necessarily weaker, but just as powerful, but perhaps not received by certain configurations.
True.
So the engineers of the 40s and 50s perhaps were eliminating some of these vitalistic functions.
Well, in the mid-30s,
yes.
Radio, which is today electronics, was at a point where if it worked, they used it before the mid-30s. In other words, a lot of people came in, gee, that sounds like a great idea, let's try it. So they tried. And what they would do is, if something worked, they incorporate it. By about the mid-30s, the physicists were starting to get a handle on Hertzian waves, how they work. And we got the idea of engineering modeling by the mid-30s. You work it all out mathematically, you wouldn't do it empirically. Before the mid-30s, everything was developed empirically. That's why you saw some of the strangest stuff in layouts in the old radios.
Right.
That's my interest in the old radios, is what did they do and why. They had things as binocular coils, cancel field coils, they had strange capacitor assemblies. And somebody found they worked better. They didn't know why they worked better, but they worked better. They used them, they patented them, they used them. But by the mid-30s, the physicists and the engineers will say, okay, here's the mathematics that shows you what's going on inside of the radio. And they got to a point where they were more concerned, did it make sense mathematically or whether or not it worked.
Okay.
So we then got away from the radio. And they got to a point where they were more concerned, did it make sense mathematically or whether or not it worked.
Okay.
So we then got away from these unknown functions, and these functions weren't understood, and went to more of the known, understandable functions. Also, these known and understandable functions are much more predictable. It took a lot of tinkering with a lot of these weird designs to get them to work the way they should. With the known functions, you go on a production line, build 1,000 radios, and maybe only lose 10 of them. With these weird functions, you might build 1,000, you'd be lucky if you get 800 of them to work.
And this is what Moray was talking about with his tubes, that so few of them actually
work, yeah.
Cohered this function.
Well, he also probably had, tolerance troubles. If he had the modern capability we have today of making high tolerance machine parts, he probably could have gotten we could have defined it and gotten many more, much higher yield out of his production.
It also seems to me that those early researchers, starting from right after the American Civil War, I mean, we're hearing a lot of feedback on certain people like Nathan Stubblefield's longitudinal telephone transmitters, and Mahlon Loomis. Yeah. See, Mahlon Loomis was another fellow who was developing teletransmissions way back using kites and just telephone receivers plugged into the ground. And he claimed that an electrical layer in the atmosphere was powering the whole thing.
Idea.
Right, this is a long time before Tesla, though.
Yeah.
So it just seems to me, if I can interject, that the earlier researchers were moving into a very powerful and fluid discovery field, and then somehow this was all choked off by the engineers.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you tie in now with Reich? What happened with your discoveries with Reich?
Well, what you're talking of is the information base I have on him.
Yes.
I was up at a ham fest It's a ham radio flea market up at Deerfield, New Hampshire. And I was walking down, these things are usually rows, aisles, and a guy selling out of the back